All right, welcome. As you're joining the webinar, if you can keep yourself on mute, unless, and you know who you are, we get to the time for other people to join in here. But I'm so thrilled that you were able to join us this afternoon. I'm gonna give it just a minute so that we get people out of the waiting room. If you're in the Northeast, the Sun Belt, the Midwest, nearly anywhere, I hope that you're staying warm. I hope that you're staying away from catastrophic weather. It's been quite a week of January. All right, with that, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. Welcome. My name is Caroline Stratton, and I'm the Associate Director of Research at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. And this webinar is introducing a new resource out from NDIA called the Digital Equity Researcher Inventory. I'm going to cover the inventory, what it looks like, what it consists of, but I'm also going to use the bulk of the time of this webinar really to think about ties between research and practice and things that our community wants to see when it comes to research and practice. And I've invited some panelists to join me to share their perspectives so that we can think together about this. I'm hoping that this will feel like sort of an initial conversation about some of what this could look like. So our agenda today, I am going to spend the least amount of time on these first two things of just telling you a little bit about the researcher inventory and some things to know before and while you're using it. I'm going to spend the most amount of time on thinking about what we gain from closer research practice ties, and I'm going to do that with the help of some great panelists that I will introduce to you shortly. But first I want to say that if you don't know us, if you haven't engaged with us before, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, there we are. We advance digital equity, we support community programs, and we also equip policymakers to act. We have more than 1,900 organizations affiliated with ours that belong to 50 states and quite a few US territories, as well as 41 tribal entities. So we have a big community, and it's one that I'm excited to see how many folks are interested in thinking about research and what it has to do with this community. The Researcher Inventory Project had the very generous and helpful support of 35 Mile Foundation, and I'm going to turn it over to Adam Miller, the Executive Director of 35 Mile Foundation, for just a couple moments to tell us what they're about and where their interest in this project came from. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thanks for the introduction. Again, my name is Adam Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of 35 Mile Foundation. I'm joined today by my colleague somewhere on here, Cassie Baer. 35 Mile Foundation is a grant maker, a partner, technology collaborator, and we're working to narrow the digital divide, achieve social justice, and make it easier for people to equitably participate in today's digital society. When Angela approached us about our interest in funding the Digital Equity Researcher Inventory Project, we immediately recognized the appeal of such a tool. The right tool can really transform effort into efficiency. It's why we don't use butter knives to eat soup. And we see the researcher inventory as an investment in a tool that has long been missing. It will allow those working in the digital equity space to make informed decisions and create sound programs and policies. And we're honored to be just a small part of making this great resource happen. If you'd like to learn more about our organization, you can visit 35mile.org. That's the number 35. mile.org. And if after learning more about us, you feel you have a project that seems unfundable by traditional funders in the space, or if you have a need for affordable internet, just give us a shout. If you have other types of partnership ideas that you think would benefit our organizations, we'd love to hear from you. So that's really all I wanted to say. I appreciate the chance to talk a little bit about 35 Mile Foundation, and over to you. I've always wanted to say that. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we're going to drop links in the chat too as we go. You see, I've got colleagues who are already on it. I am excited to share, and I didn't get to drum up interest in this webinar by telling you who my panelists were ahead of time, but I'm joined by 3 people who have really interesting perspectives and roles when it comes to producing and using research around digital equity. So joining us today are Dr. Judy Shanley. She's an assistant VP in education and youth transition, among other things, with Easter Seals National Office. Stacy Wedlake, who's a research scientist in the Technology and Social Change Group at University of Washington, and Isaac Carrasco-Ortiz, who is a Digital Equity Fellow in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Aging and Independence. And surprisingly, all of those folks, I think, have other affiliations and even longer titles, but I'll allow them to tell us a little bit more about who they are and their involvement in this space after I get through some introductory stuff about the inventory. So what is the researcher inventory? This launched in early December of 2024. I'm going to show it to you shortly. And it is at its heart, a list of researchers. Part of the inspiration here is that we know that digital equity is a really multidisciplinary space. We know that all kinds of people do work that might inform it, whether they're using the term digital equity or not necessarily when it comes to their work. But we know that this is a bigger network of folks and that we don't always do a great job of identifying everybody in this network. And that if we could do something like that, it would give us some real power to be able to say, here's this broader set of people who are interested in these topics. So this is ultimately a list of researchers rather than a list of documents or a list of pieces of research. These are folks who work in the digital equity space, and that's sort of broadly defined. A couple of the things that were important for us when we were developing this were these were folks with some sort of publication to point to. In academic literature, or the thing that's called gray literature, that refers to publications that are sort of outside of that space. You might think about things like white papers or working papers, or reports. A couple of the terms were things that we said, yes, they're part of this network, were work about broadband adoption, as well as digital inclusion. So this brings together a huge variety of folks with interests that are really varied. Our list itself includes the institution that they are affiliated with. And this is where I have a caveat. It includes a URL to view publication record. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And it includes for most folks, and you can see that this isn't uniform across the board, but some indication about the discipline that they work in or were trained in. And for some people, also some research interests. It's not true necessarily of everybody. You'll see that there are people we've identified that we don't have that record fully filled out for, in part because we are working from publicly available information here. And I'll also give you some information about ways that you could update this or add to it too. If you perhaps are in there and see something you want to change, or you think of other people who ought to be included in this space. So I'm going to navigate over there, but not until I've run through really quickly some things to keep in mind before using the inventory. The first is that this is a living resource. So this is reflecting the work and the careers of people who are active in this space. And so we know that people change institutions, people get new jobs. Careers start, careers end also. So it's possible that information here may become inaccurate over time. We also know, if you've been in the research space, that folks' research interests change over time. That this might mean that somebody who did a lot of work about broadband adoption or digital inclusion, but doesn't really do that anymore, still in our list. It also means that people, working in the space who then find digital inclusion might be added over time. It's just because somebody has worked on something in the past doesn't mean that will carry over necessarily in the future, but it's still there. Also know right now that what we're thinking about for the data in there is to do something like quarterly updates. If you recently submitted an update, and by recently, I mean about in the last month, I have to appreciate your patience. I promise that those updates are going to occur shortly. We're also thinking about once a year taking a look at what's in there to make sure that things like institutional affiliation is correct. If you yourself are in there and you've got a change to submit, like, oh, got a new job, I work elsewhere, or you want to change something up around your interests or something like that, feel free to use the channels that are suggested on the page to do that. I'm going to show you the page right now in case you have not seen it. I am not going to read it to you. And I think, please, all right, I had to scroll up to the top. This page, if you haven't seen our new fresh website look, we've got new colors, we've got new fonts, we've got new designs. I'm not going to read this text to you, but I would encourage you if you're using this to kind of look through this and think about it. There's some suggested ways that this might be helpful to you right here. Most of all, we are thinking about this as a way to connect with other people. It may be that what you see is, here's some folks that work in a specific space. You want to go read their work, easily done from here. It may also be that you see folks in your local area and you might be thinking, well, I'm really interested in locating some assistance with how my program gathers data or analyzes it or works with publicly available data. Or we're looking for evaluation services or other kinds of research. Or I really want to know what the state of the art looks like right now, and something around like digital inclusion in aging individuals or health applications. As mentioned, it looks like a list. You can do things like sort and filter, and you'll see here across that we've got things like discipline and digital equity related research interests, which allow you to do something like, say, I just want to look at everybody in here who comes from the planning field, for example, do things like that. I also want to mention, you'll see that most of the websites listed in here are a Google Scholar site, and there's a reason behind that. And some of that is around what is persistent. So I mentioned before, people move institutions, and one of the features, I suppose, of Google Scholar that it offers us is sort of a persistent link to what a person's published before. I also want to mention that, say you visit somebody's Google Scholar page, you see a publication that you really, looks fascinating. The title tells you, and the snippet you can see is like, I want to go read this. It's highly possible that you're going to hit some paywalls when you do this. And I'm going to ask one of our panelists a little bit later to talk about, this will come up when we talk with our panelists about paywalls. Do I really have to pay, let's say, $45 to read this article to find out if it's, tells me the thing I want? The answer we're going to offer you mostly is that most of the folks in here would be thrilled to send you a copy of their work if you see something that interests you, that you want to review. Like I mentioned, if there's information you'd like to change in here, there's an entry about you, feel free to email us. There's an email listed here. If you'd like to add an entry, and again, I mentioned that we're going to attempt to review these about quarterly, and I'll do one soon. We've got a button that leads to a form to do that process. There's information here, again, I'm not going to read to you about where this comes from, where these names came from. Those caveats that I mentioned, they were important enough that I wanted you to know, and some folks who helped us along the way here. All right, so I'm going to switch back to my slides. And I appreciate my colleagues who are monitoring the chat, answering questions, and offering us information as we go. I am now very, very excited to have a conversation with some folks who all have really interesting links to research about how they use it, how they produce it, what we could get from closer research practice ties. And I'm hoping that this will be a conversation not just for me and 3 panelists, but also that the community will be eager to join in and think about things we might do together or what our priorities start to look like. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing. I am going to see if we can't get those folks spotlighted so that we can see their faces. They are joining us. It's happening. There we go. They're popping onto the screen. There they are. All right. Welcome. So like I've mentioned before, Joining me is Judy Shanley of Easter Seals, Stacy Wedlake of University of Washington, and Isaac Carrasco-Ortiz of the Massachusetts Executive Office on Aging and Independence, I think. And they may all have extra stuff to add to their affiliations when they introduce themselves. But so, right, the first thing I want to put to you is to ask you to tell us a little bit, your short story about how you came to work in digital equity or to work on topics related to it. Judy, I'm going to kick it to you first.
Or hi, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited that you all are passionate about research and want to spend some time talking with us about how to apply research. My career path and how I came to be is kind of a long and winding road, and I think there's a song like that. But I'm a human service professional by background. That's how I consider myself. I'm really thinking about human-centered needs and any gaps that exist across people and their conditions. And I ended up moving. I have my PhD is actually in education and special education. I was working as a youth transition person. So I was helping youth with disabilities procure post-school, post-high school jobs and college and be successful. And I thought, I always am stymied because transportation is a need for those individuals. And no one in youth transition workforce development was thinking about transportation. And so like her position is actually the AVP for youth transition, but the other part of my job is transportation. Because transportation underpins everything we do, access to healthcare, access to food. And then I started thinking, well, transportation underpins everything. Well, so does digital inclusion and digital equity and digital literacy. And so had occasion to develop a relationship. Easter Seals did, the national office, with NDIA a number of years ago. We've been working on projects since, but I think of myself as kind of a blender where I'm able to blend my educational experience with my experience in transportation, because I'm sure you all have challenges associated with getting the people you work with to your sites. And then the digital equity piece, it underpins transportation as well. And I'll talk a little about that in the time, but I never would have imagined myself in this position. And I think that's the exciting thing. Career paths can take any direction that you want. You just have to be passionate about it. So that's where I came from.
Thanks, Judy. I was especially excited for this group of folks because you all have such interesting and very different stories here. Stacy, tell us, how did you come to work on topics around digital equity?
Hi, thanks everyone for having me. It's great. Again, yeah, echo, it's always great to have a bunch of people here wanting to talk about research. So yes, also kind of a bit of a winding path. I actually got started in the space as an accidental computer instructor. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mongolia on a very unrelated topic, but became like the IT help desk and actually developed like some lessons and stuff with another volunteer that we did while I was there. And then I came back to the States just as the Great Recession was starting. And I ended up teaching computer classes through an employment agency for a few years before starting graduate school. And I just become kind of aware of this, of people's needs in this space. And so then I was intending to go back into like nonprofits but then got kind of through a series of very fortunate events, I kind of am here now as a career researcher, focusing on these topics. And my research is definitely kind of very broad in this space, but I definitely have a lot of background with digital skills. Again, partially based on the fact that I have this one-on-one experience doing instruction. But then more recently, in the last few years, I've been focusing more on kind of information media literacy aspects of digital skills, and I work a lot with public libraries in this space to develop kind of resources and tools for helping people navigate online environments. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Stacy. And last and definitely not least, I was really excited to bring Isaac along with us too, because I know him to be a fascinating user of research in his digital inclusion practice. Isaac, tell us your digital equity origin story.
Yeah, yeah. Again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to see, a lot of people here and we get to talk about research. Um, but yeah, so big note, I am not a full-time employee with the Executive Office of Aging and Independence, formerly known as the Executive Office of Elder Affairs, in Massachusetts. I am serving there as an ACC AmeriCorps member, where we help
I
serve.
omitted this.
Um, no
Yes,
worries, no
American
worries.
Connection Corps, lead for America.
Yeah, no worries. I always add that in. Yeah, and this is actually my second year. My journey in terms of digital equity started last year. It was actually my first sort of venture in digital equity uh, work, and I had been doing technological classes for older adults at ABCD Elder Services. Um, but that's, I think, where the research aspect of it came to be because, you know, I I'd never been in the classroom with older adults. I'd never taught technology before. And, I was going home day after day and I was realizing, "Hey, this is really hard." And in my mind, I thought, I'm willing to bet the dollar that I have in my pocket right now. I'm super sure that somebody at some point has written, what are the best methods for teaching digital literacy for older adults in this particular scenario. I was willing to bet. So I kind of went back into my school era of, going through research and thinking, okay, well, maybe I need to find this and that. And I ended up finding plenty of, research articles related to, how to teach technology for older adults. And I thought, this is amazing. Here was, a nice little tutorial or, insight as to how I could go about this. And that's essentially, I've never looked back. Digital research in digital equity has been my best friend, regarding this type of work. It's completely changed, how I operate within this environment. And I'm really it's been the best, and it's so fun to see what other people have discovered, different insights, how things might look different. It's just there's so much out there and it's so helpful. Yeah. I'll say that for
Isaac,
now.
Isaac is a notable user too of our listservs to have conversations about research of like, is there anything out there about this? In ways that are it's great to see that kind of conversation. I have a lot of specific prompts for you guys, but I think where I might start actually is with Isaac for thinking about this. So one of the things that is notable to me about your journey with research is that you've gotten really comfortable looking for it and reading it. And research can be intimidating, it can be dense. It is not usually written for just anyone to read. If you've produced research, you know that sometimes we're producing it for a very narrow audience. Is there anything that you'd tell folks about? And I also know like you've encountered research from a lot of different disciplines. Is there anything you would tell folks about in terms of advice or things that you've discovered as you've read more academic literature, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I would note that my background is not in technology. I studied sociology in college. So, you know, chugging through maybe these different papers that are, maybe about computer science were really intimidating. But um, what I found most helpful is that one, once you read through a lot of them, you start to see, what the pieces are to each paper or article. There might be a particular introduction, there might be a particular section about background information, which you can make that judgment about whether you should read this or maybe you should be okay without reading it. Usually the when you kind of scroll through or go through different articles, the conclusion will always have, essentially, this is what we want to say and we want people to remember. But also, what I also found really helpful is, sometimes it'll have the email of the people who participated in the study. You can always try reaching out to them as well. I reached out a few times to a few researchers and they got back to me and we set up meetings and it was super fun because we got to talk, live time about the work that they had done and maybe I know that they had also mentioned about, I was going to put this in the paper, but X, Y, and Z, and so they maybe get to expand a bit more on it. So I think it is intimidating because of the vocabulary, but if you're able to understand the essence of what's being said, and if you have the opportunity to meet with the people who participated in it, who maybe can provide deeper and more in-depth information in a conversation, um, they're always everybody that I've talked to is always super happy to share. We always end up going over time because the conversations are just amazing. But I think it's less about knowing the nitty-gritty and more so understanding about the purpose of why, these individuals set out to write this paper in the first place.
Yeah. No, that's super useful. This makes me think about teaching students about how to read research. And one of the biggest, most interesting and important practices is that you can skip parts. That's huge. And Isaac, that's part of why just such a cool part of our community that you also have done things like reach out to the researchers to talk to them about the studies. Stacy and I were talking about this yesterday about paywalled literature, and that most of the time you will find somebody on the other end of an email who would be thrilled that you read their article. So if there's of the many takeaways we might get here, one of them is that those kinds of inquiries are welcome almost all the time. Stacy, you have been involved with a great deal of participatory research and co-design processes with community-based organizations. Can you tell us more about that and things you might want our community to know about establishing those kinds of partnerships?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And yes, just want to reiterate the point. If you reach out to a researcher, it says like, I want to read your article. I read your article and I really enjoyed it. And I have these questions again, like we spend years just even getting like the thing like it's done, but just trying to get it published. Like so it's thrilling to actually see communicate with people on the other side that are finding it valuable. So just wanted to put another plug in for that. And yes, if you email me and ask for a copy of an article that's behind a paywall, I will send it to you. So because again, I want people to use this. So just wanted to reiterate that point. But yeah, so yes, I've done a lot of participatory work with specifically with public libraries in the last few years. And so and it kind of comes about in kind of lots of different ways, depending on the project. Sometimes, and it's often, through I've try to stay active and connected to the broader professional community who that my research is about. And so I've, developed kind of relationships with people over the years. And so sometimes it's a matter of me reaching out and, to somebody and asking if they're interested. But what often happens is although I do have personal connections, I also have kind of what I call like community connectors. And so these are people who are extremely integrated into the field. They're maybe practitioners themselves, or they're like very practitioner adjacent. Like they run like, again, case of public libraries, like they work at a public library support organization. I would probably describe like everybody, all the staff members at NDIA as community connectors, which would have this like, and I say, hey, I'm working on this project, or I'm interested in people that are doing this, like, who can you recommend that and they will like help me make a connection. And so they'll do like a warm email. And so I can get connected to people that way. And so that's especially for projects that maybe have already like I've gotten funding for them and I'm looking for people to work on them. And so I'm looking for participants. For kind of before a project, and this can happen before a project is funded, but more often when in the project proposal development phase, again, I might, again, these are folks that I have kind of previous relationships with, and that, that we're like slowly over a period of time kind of cooking up an idea. and it's like we've talked about some things, and then it's a matter of kind of finding the right kind of funding opportunity that that can support that, because maybe, and to make explicit that really my work is grant supported and grant funded, so I have to find a funding stream that will allow me to engage in that work. And so in certain cases, yeah, I think the way that it mostly works is this is something that either like something that we've seen, like the researchers see as a need as we're working through these communities, or again, it's like there's a call and we're like, like we kind of do work related to this, like what's something that we can like create that would respond to this funding call. But again, I think that but as this one example of this one public library that we've worked with over a long period of time, they're very engaged in like in the work that we're doing in this research. And as part of this these projects, we are creating like programs and resources and tools for the public libraries to use. And this library is very active in trying things out and very willing to try new things. And so then we've gotten to know each other and trust each other. And so we're now kind of going together to go after a piece of funding as partners from the beginning stages. And so that's kind of how it works a little bit. And it's very slow. Just kind of emphasize like that this is kind of, these are relationships often like over the course of years, and even if we have a specific thing that we're trying to get funded, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 times to find the right, or just to get lucky that the right the program officer, or kind of crafting the proposal at the right exact time. So yes, so it's not necessarily, it's very kind of messy, and like but it's really about relationships, I guess, at its core. If I should, I guess, try to set a sound bite, it's about developing relationships with folks over a period of time, and be willing to kind of go through those processes of trying to find support to do the work that you want to do.
Yeah, thank you so much too for helping us think through some of like the practical constraints too. So something the researcher inventory obscures are that researchers have all sorts of priorities, constraints, incentives, motivations in play at once. And so something like everything's got to be like contracting grant funded is not the same for everybody. And being positioned in something like government versus a university versus a nonprofit, all of those sort of things make the circumstances different. And so know that, again, it's kind of thinking about the researcher inventory. There's a lot there, and there's a lot to discover through a conversation with people about what their priorities might be. I also want to mention too, be remiss to mention, I love this set of guests too, because there's so many different ways to engage with research. There's everything from free, I want to know what it says, free if I ask somebody to find this publication, to, this is a long-term together engagement with a lot of money behind it. There's everything, and like there's a spectrum of ways to engage, and the folks that in front of us here today are kind of why I wanted to get at these different parts of the map. There's so many different things that we might do. Judy, Stacy's comments especially made me think about some opportunities right now, or ways that our community might think about an intersection that you know really well, which is around digital equity and transportation and accessibility.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that intersection, things you see right now? You're in this really unique space of having like multiple disciplines or practice areas where you see how digital inclusion fits in them. Ideas for us around transportation or other things you see?
Sure. First, it just dawned on me that, when you said research may seem daunting and complex and nerdy to some, right? You think of researchers as nerdy. Look at us, we're not nerdy, and I never really think of myself as a researcher. I think of myself as a research to practice person. And similar to what Stacy said, I think that one of the most important things is to ensure that there's applicability and relevance to the research being done. I used to work at the U.S. Department of Education. When we wrote research grants, there was always that piece in the research grants which included application. And similarly, now that I work in the transportation research sector, there's always a piece in the priorities and the NOFOs that come out that ask about application. I'm always big on universal design for learning. So you likely know universal design is making sure our physical environment is accessible to all people, regardless of their needs. And particularly, we think of curb cuts, we think of door handles, but universal design for learning is all about creating content that is accessible in multiple ways for people. We all don't learn in the same way. I don't learn by reading. I need alternate formats to learn content. And so I think your role as digital literacy experts can really help with that to ensure that the content is universally designed and applied so that people can really use it. And in the transportation space, we're seeing more and more the U.S. Access Board release standards associated with transportation agencies, federally funded under the ADA agencies, to ensure that their websites are accessible, their apps. How many of you use an app to access public transportation or learn about a schedule for a particular transportation mode? So there's a real push for transportation providers, planners, departments of transportation to ensure that the materials are accessible. And in my work as a technical assistance provider, the research practice piece, they're looking for people like you. They're looking for experts to help them create content that is most accessible to a variety of audiences. And I think, having transportation professionals sit on advisory committees, even you attending, there's a requirement for local planning and transportation agencies to have a coordinated planning effort. So they invite human services organization planners. Why not find out about those opportunities and connect with the transportation planning and providers in the community and offer your assistance as a digital equity, digital inclusion expert? I go around the country a lot to do technical assistance. Rarely do I see people of your expertise sitting at the transportation table. And what you know and what you could offer is so critical to engaging such an array of people and accessible and inclusive communities. So I'd say be at the table, take research. If you are able to bring your research to the table to transportation people, I think we're encouraging the field to be more critical consumers of the kinds of interventions that they implement. And you can help them do that, figure out the best strategies for different audiences. And you can also help them validate practices, because research really is not only a catalyst for practice, but it's a way to validate what you're doing and confirm that what you're doing has evidence that it's going to work. So I hope that in my travels around technical assistance, around transportation, that I get to see more and more of you at the table.
Yeah, that's such an interesting intersection. It feels like as we've brought in, as more people find things like the intersection of health and digital equity, we're getting more of those intersections, and transportation is one that's still just waiting to waiting to emerge here. But I also imagine for folks who have ever offered digital navigation, taught any sort of class in a public access space, you have interacted with the technologies around public transit and knowing that the people we serve often use it. It's a lot there. I want to chat about something and I'm going to be mindful of time too, so that our audience gets to ask us some questions. Stacy, I want to chat with you for just a minute. So folks in our community do rightfully get really interested in evaluation research. And If you were in our community call last Friday, Amy Gonzalez of UC Santa Barbara presented a really great new resource for nonprofits for thinking about evaluation and doing it, if you have few resources, how do you make that happen? Stacey, you and I were also kind of talking and thinking about the world of research beyond that. Will you tell us a little bit about some of the opportunities or the benefits for community organizations of engaging in research that it's not necessarily that kind of narrowly focused?
Sure. Yes. Yes. Just reiterate as well. Yes, evaluation is critical and important, and I think it makes sense because it's such a critical part to, again, the kind of the everyday realities of running these programs and when you do it well, and again, often when practitioners often have their own funding that they're receiving, evaluation is like a chunk, and so kind of looking for somebody to do that. But yeah, as you're saying that there's so many more opportunities to opportunities to engage with researchers, and I think it goes to well, what kind of questions do you have about either the way that you're doing the work, about the communities that you're wanting to serve, and these can be kind of some bigger picture questions, or they can also be questions around kind of what I've been kind of focused on thinking about is, again, these kind of practical ways of actually doing the work. And so this work with public libraries in specific, I've been doing a lot of work with rural public libraries. And so they want to they want to be able to engage their communities more about how to support them, navigating online information environments, and how to do that successfully, avoiding bad information, misinformation, and being able to find the information that they want. And and for public and so there's a lot of work that's going on in school settings. But what's great about a school is that the kids kind of have to be there. They come to their class and there's a teacher in front, and it's going to be these instruction. But when thinking about addressing some of these topics in a public library or a community organization where people have to be kind of motivated to show up and less likely to sit in something that feels like a class, what are other ways to learn these things? And additionally, I think the librarians also have a lot of questions. The people they're working with have a lot of questions around they just aren't, things change so fast with technology or best practices, and so they feel like that they need better training. They need to be able better training for themselves or for the other that they work with. And so one of the things that we were working with them is creating training tools, professional development resources for themselves and others. And so that's kind of as what Judy was talking about, these kind of practical, kind of applied outputs. So there is these very tangible benefits that the libraries are getting in these and then for us, we're answering kind of some bigger picture research questions around well, how can we make these things, or what works, or what's different about creating tools for a public library versus a school, so things like that. So the researchers are getting the information we need to be able to do our academic publications, and then the libraries are getting these very kind of practical tools that they can use in their own libraries, or new knowledge and skills. So that's one kind of example of a kind of outputs of a collaboration, a type of collaboration that is different than asking kind of for a simple, not simple. Evaluations are really simple. Evaluation.
Yeah, that there's a lot of there are other things too. Isaac and I were talking about this yesterday. Isaac, I don't think I shared with you. I also had a moment of teaching computer classes and looking for research like how to motivate adult learners. Of a panic about that. But we were talking yesterday too about the broader value of reading widely, of thinking about technological change. There's a long history to digital inclusion work too. that there are things that we might learn and draw from that. All right, we have arrived at 3:45 p.m. And while I could ask our panelists a million questions, and I will if need be, if you have questions for our panelists, also, if you've got ideas for us. So this might be regarding the researcher inventory. It might be regarding things that our panelists have shared. Could be regarding things you want to see, you're thinking about our affiliate community wants or needs or things we ought to try. In publicizing the researcher inventory in this webinar, I've gotten questions like, you can start a listserv. Is this a working group? Is this, what is this? And I've also seen people's individual practices, like Isaac, for example. I know that you've kept like summaries of research, like you had a Google Doc of like older adults and chatbots. Here's what I've, here's what I've found. Here's what I've talked to, like who I've talked to. Somebody immediately sent me like, here's my 40-page Google Doc where I keep the things I need when I write proposals when the researcher inventory came out. So if you've got practices to share, if you've got anything you want to add, I would love to hear it. I also see in the chat, because I am multitasking, that we've got a question about research outside of the US, which is a great question and a caveat, I guess, that I wasn't thinking about with respect to our researcher inventory. And something that I'm going to throw back to our audience too in a sec, or our panelists. So what is in there is really US centric. That you'll see the institutions folks are with are generally all US based. That is not to say that this research, that this is a purely US phenomenon. One of the things that it is to say is that this sometimes goes by different terms in different places. And that like using keywords like digital inclusion is likely to find you potentially other stuff in Anglophone countries. Research about, settings in Australia, Canada, the UK, so on. One piece to know about this, and Stacy kind of alluded to this earlier, this is an area I used to do research in, is this goes often by the name ICT for development. If we're talking about what we might call developing country, or if we're talking about non-US and especially non-Anglophone contexts, that is a more common kind of label for it. Isaac, you and I, will you tell us about digital equity as a search term? We were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief because there's a lot to say, but try to be brief. Digital equity, two things. One, digital equity itself as a term to investigate goes by many other different phrases and words. Technological support, computers and technology. It can go by many, many different phrases and words, and how people are understanding it according to their disciplines. A psychologist and their psychology team might look at the phenomenon that involves digital equity in a different lens compared to, say, a computer scientist or a person working in computer design. They'll speak and talk about it differently, but everybody's really getting at the same thing, which is how are people making sense of the technology that they use, whether it's psychologically, whether it's socially, whether it's economically, maybe from an infrastructure point of view, many different levels of disciplines. And when I say that, it's actually what I came across, trying to find different phrases. I realized that some people in my own backyard in Boston were looking at things regarding digital equity, and digital equity as a phrase never showed up once in their paper. Maybe they spoke about, technological inclusion or, digital rights or something like that. What we see there is that this is truly a multidisciplinary phenomenon. Like Judy had mentioned, this encapsulates many different industries, and it is manifested in different ways in those different industries. So just because something doesn't say it's digital equity work in a particular paper, the content very much might be there, and the person or the people behind it are equally as passionate and interested, and maybe they would value from someone telling them, hey, by the way, we're a part of this work in digital equity. You might want to read more about this, or here's what I can tell you more about it. So that's what I would say. It's very much a multidisciplinary phenomenon that affects across many different disciplines.
And it means that people use different vocabulary. There are different terms of art, different labels, different keywords. And man, that makes finding things hard sometimes. Judy,
Yeah.
you want to chime in?
I have experienced that so much coming from the education and human service sector to transportation. I use language because I'm most familiar with education and human services audiences. When I'm in front of a group of transportation professionals, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I think one of the first things you have to do is when you're conducting research or when you're trying to think about research to practice and facilitating the use and application of research is make sure everybody understands the terminology that you're using. It's really, really important to have common meanings and definitions so that there's no misunderstanding down the road in terms of application.
But it does flat out make something like a search, like what keywords are going to get you the thing that you think you want. That could make this hard because this goes by different names, and so being creative and resourceful when it comes to that. I'm looking at Michael's question in the chat around an idea here about sharing RFPs. So when it comes to requests for proposals around research, one thing I would absolutely encourage you to do if you see one, if you are issuing one, like Michael mentions here, ComputeOpt would be, putting those out on our listserv could be a very interesting strategy. There is a lot happening on our listserv at all times. But that's definitely a place where that could happen. Let's see. So David is also thinking about development or recommended tagging be part of a researcher collaboration. Absolutely. So the sort of taxonomy or set of tags things right now in the inventory is limited to the terms that folks are putting on their own Google Scholar profiles. It is imperfect. It is not a controlled vocabulary. If you're the kind of person who knows things and cares about things like that, it is not at that shape yet. And so yes, there's absolutely room for us to improve this, help it to grow, let people go, use more constrained sets of tags and things to make this more usable. Absolutely. That's great.
Yeah, it's a big challenge because I think, within kind of the researchers that are active in this community, I think that's definitely something, to work on. But again, if you think about for an academic, when they're publishing research in a particular journal in a particular field, they really do, like, you're allowed like 5 keywords or so, and you have to be responsive to the terminology used in that field to make sure your research is findable in that field. Because ultimately, for most of researchers situated within a university, they're partially like evaluated on how many times they're cited. And that is a very important metric for them. And so they want to make sure that the research is findable in the area. And within academia, there is less incentive for your research, even though should be, a lot of people do applied work, there's less of an incentive for its uptake in like practitioner communities. And often there is more of a, it takes effort on the researcher's part to try to explain like the impact that it's had outside of it, or it's harder to know. Like I'll find out like offhandedly years later, I'm like, oh yeah, like that report, we used it to inform da 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 da. And I was like, okay, I'm putting that in my yearly impact, but for my merit, because it's but again, it can be harder to explain to somebody else who doesn't do that kind of applied work or is not as familiar with the field. So I think it's something, it's nice to work towards and try to create some common vocabulary, but it's a very naughty challenge for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, and for folks who have, for example, emailed and said like, oh, please change the tags on my work, be happy to. Again, working off of some things that are publicly available there too, because it's a big task. For reasons Stacy mentioned, so like this is, I can't say it enough, like what a unique group of 3 people I have gathered here today. In part because like Isaac is a sort of research user who is a bold explorer to go investigate it. And then there are also people thinking about it like, of how do I do this translation work? How do I position myself so that I'm sure that those, because I'm not sure that somebody's going to go read the conclusion of my paper. It's like, how do I make sure those messages get out there? I think that's one thing across our affiliate community. We have people with many different relationships to research, of how they use it, how they find it, how it works best for them. And again, if you've got questions, if you have ideas for us, this is a topic that people clearly want more of. There are a few spaces where we get together and talk about this, but even thinking about like the folks listed in the researcher inventory, there are likely people who would say, oh, I didn't even know that this was a community that my work could be considered part of. We're very much sort of like a synthetic community over the top of a whole bunch of disciplines here. So that is part of our challenge and part of why we're getting together for this conversation. Surely there are more questions.
Hey, Caroline, just one thing I was thinking about, there's a push across the transportation sector to be more integrated in other federal and state agencies and the local work that comes with that. Realizing that there needs to be efficiency and realizing that transportation, like digital literacy, affects everybody's access to community. And so I think timing is good for people to think about maybe partnerships that they had not thought of before, and using that research directory to form relationships and maybe find RFP and NOFOs that maybe are novel and out of the box thinking. But I know in the transportation sector, there's always an interest by the Federal Transit Administration, the Federal Department of Transportation, to be more innovative in thinking. And so I think we're at a good time now to think about those relationships and the novel topical focus of those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I also too want to suggest that, so there's been this renewed focus too on serving covered populations as named in the Digital Equity Act. And that I also want you to know that Judy, a connector of people, if you find yourself needing resources around disability or thinking about what the accessibility and disability community looks like in your area, Judy is a fantastic person to connect with there.
Thanks. We also have Easter Seals. I hope you all work with your local Easter Seals. We've got a network of over 70 affiliates around the country, and there are amazing, amazing colleagues that are accessible to you. So knock on their door if you're not already having a relationship with those entities. I know many of them operate assistive technology labs and are involved in other kinds of curriculum and training. So knock on their door.
And I also offer my knock on their door about Stacy, knowing a lot about community research, co-design processes, public libraries. I know not yet out, but new resources around information and media literacy for libraries to come soon. Look for those on the listserv. Isaac is the best expert practitioner of research that I can think of. Is around the listserv, I know, and we'll be starting conversations about research, undoubtedly. If at any moment you need a boost when it comes to contacting a researcher, finding a paper, anything like that, we are here for you. And know that this is not the last time that we will gather to talk about research. I really hope. I am opening back my slides for just one moment to say.
But we are not nerds. Right? Is that the message?
We are approachable.
Approachable nerds. Speak for yourself, Judy.
I
just want to say, if you are new to our community today, join us. We are big. We have a very active listserv. People ask and answer questions all the time. If you find yourself and you're like, what are the pedagogical methods for older adults in classroom settings? All of a sudden, you can take that to the listserv. the last thing I just want to say is thank you. Thank you to 35 Mile Foundation. Thank you to these wonderful panelists. Thanks to you for attending. It's really exciting to have this many people together who want to hear and think about research. And I would also feel free to reach out if there is something that we can do to support these better research practice ties. This is really exactly what I had hoped for. I hope that you have an excellent rest of your afternoon. Thanks again, y'all.
Bye, everybody.